Hey y'all, Tom, ND3N here, and thanks for dropping into my shack for another discussion about ham radio band plans. This time, we're going to be looking at what are commonly called the HF bands, all of them. But that is a bit of a misnomer. We're going to start with the low frequency or LF band with a wavelength of 2200 meters. Then we're going to move up to the medium frequency bands with wavelengths of 630 and 160 meters. Finally, we're going to look at the high frequency or HF bands, which include wavelengths from 80 to 10 meters. As always, suggestions, corrections, questions, and general remarks can be left in the comments.
10 questions in a comment section? Sweet mama.
We're going to start with the two experimental bands that are not supported by commercially available ham radios, the 2200 and the 630 meter band. The 2200 meter band runs from 135.7 to 137.8 kilohertz, and it has a power output limit of 1 watt equivalent isotropic radiated power, or EIRP. The 630 meter band runs from 472 to 479 kilohertz and has a 5 watt EIRP maximum power limit, except in Alaska within 496 miles of Russia. We're going to be talking a lot about different power types. The equivalent isotropic radiated power characterizes the properties of a transmitter. It is based on the transmitted power and the antenna gain, and it indicates the total power that would be needed for a hypothetical isotropic antenna if it were to produce the same power density as, say, a beam antenna. Now, there's a lot of math involved, which is beyond the scope of this video. However, I have put a link in the video description if you want to do a deeper dive on it yourself. Now we'll move on to those bands that are included in most, but not all, commercially available ham radios. These bands are divided first by license class privileges, which is set by FCC regulations, and then by the band plan, which is partially regulated by the FCC, and then by informal gentlemen's agreements that all work together to optimize the bands for best use by the greatest number of users. The 160 meter band is allowed for license classes general and above. The band plan allows CW operations from 1.8 to 2 megahertz, with digital modes from 1.8 to 1.81 megahertz, and CWQRP at 1.81 megahertz. Additional digital modes are allowed from 1.84 to 1.843 megahertz, and that does include FT8. 1.843 to 1.999 megahertz can be used for lower sideband, slow scan TV, and other wideband modes. 1.91 megahertz is allocated to SSB QRP, and at the very top of the band, from 1.999 to 2 megahertz, that's allocated for experimental use and beacons. The 80 meter band is broken down by license class, with novice and technicians having CW-only privileges from 3.525 to 3.6 megahertz and a power limit of 200 watts PEP. General operators may operate from 5.525 to 3.6 megahertz, which is allocated for CW and data mode, and then 3.8 to 4 megahertz for lower sideband operation. Advanced class operators may operate from 5.525 to 3.6 megahertz, again allocated for CW and data modes, and 3.7 to 4 megahertz for LSB operation. Extra class operators may operate CW and data from 3.5 to 3.6 and LSB from 3.6 to 4 megahertz. Within these bands and following your license restrictions, 5.57 to 3.6 are allocated for RIDI and data, 3.845 is allocated for slow scan TV, and 3.885 is the AM calling frequency. You'll find that the longer wavelengths of the experimental 160 meters and 80 meter bands will work best during the nighttime hours. This is because longer wavelengths are absorbed by the ionospheric D layer that is prevalent during daylight hours. If you found this informative, please take a moment to pop that thumbs up icon and give me a like.
Well, I really liked it.
The 60 meter band is unusual in that it is the only ham radio band that is channelized. It is available to general class and above operators and consists of 5 channels at 5.3305, 5.3465, 5.3570, 5.3715, and 5.4035 megahertz. Each channel is available for upper sideband phone and CW, RTTY, and data communications. The upper sideband phone is limited to a 2.8 kilohertz bandwidth, and CW and digital emissions must be centered 1.5 kilohertz above the channel frequency shown. Only one signal at a time is permitted on any channel, and the maximum effective radiated power, or ERP, is 100 watts. Like the 80 meter band, the 40 meter band is available with different privileges to all ham radio operators from the novice and technician up to extra class, each with increasing privileges as the license class increases. We'll start with the novice and tech, who have CW privileges limited to 200 watts out from 7.025 to 7.125 megahertz. Generals have CW and data privileges at full legal power from 7.25 to 7.125 megahertz, and SSB phone privileges, again at full legal power, from 7.175 to 7.3 megahertz. Advanced class operators have the same CW and data privileges from 7.025 to 7.125 megahertz, and phone privileges from 7.125 to the top of the band at 7.3 megahertz. Extras get to use the entire 40 meter band with CW and data from 7 megahertz to 7.125 megahertz, and phone privileges from 7.125 to 7.3 megahertz. Within these constraints, RTTY and data is available from 7.040 to 7.125 megahertz, Slow Scan TV at 7.171 megahertz, and there is an AM calling frequency at 7.290 megahertz. 30 meter band is available to licensed classes from general to extra and starts at 10.1 megahertz going to 10.150 megahertz. CW mode is allowed throughout the entire band, with data allowed from 10.13 to 10.14 megahertz, and packet allowed from 10.14 to 10.15 megahertz. By the way, please check out the entire video because at the end I talk about packet and some discrepancies and stuff that I found in my research for this video. You'll find that the 60, 40, and 30 meter bands works best from twilight and overnight, but activity can be found during the daylight time as well. It's just a bit more rare. Please help me spread the word about this and my other videos by sharing them with your friends, especially on social media. For general class operators, the 20 meter band allows CW and data from 14.025 to 14.150 megahertz, and phone privileges from 14.225 to 14.350 megahertz. Advanced class operators have CW and data privileges from 14.025 to 14.150 megahertz, and phone privileges from 14.175 to 14.350 megahertz. Extra class operators have CW privileges from 14.0 to 14.025, CW and data privileges from 14.025 to 14.150, and phone privileges from 14.150 to 14.350 megahertz. Within these license-based subbands, 14.070 to 14.095 is allocated to data and RTTY. 14.095 to 14.995 is allocated for packet. 14.100 is allocated for DX beacons. 14.1005 to 14.112 is also packet. 14.230 is slow scan TV, and 14.286 megahertz is the AM calling frequency. The 17-meter band is for general class operators and above, and, as with all bands, allows CW across the entirety of 18.068 to 18.168 megahertz. RTTY is from 18.1 to 18.105, packet 18.105 to 18.110, and phone from 18.110 to 18.168 megahertz. For the novice and technician operators, the 15-meter band offers the CW mode with maximum output power of 200 watts from 21.025 to 21.2 megahertz. General operators may operate with full legal power using CW and data modes between 21.025 and 21.2 megahertz, along with phone privileges from 21.275 to 21.450. The advanced operators may operate CW and data modes from 21.025 to 21.2 megahertz and phone privileges from 21.225 to 21.450 megahertz. Extra class operators are allowed CW and data from 21 megahertz to 21.2 megahertz and phone privileges from 21.2 to 21.450 megahertz. Within those bands, and as allowed by your license class, RTTY and data are from 21.070 to 21.110, and slow scan TV is at 21.340 megahertz. For general, advanced, and extra class operators, the 12-meter band allows CW and digital between 24.890 and 24.930 megahertz, with phone allowed between 24.930 and 24.990 megahertz. RTTY is between 24.920 and 24.925, and packet is between 24.925 and 24.930 megahertz. The 10-meter band offers novice and technician class operators not only CW and data privileges from 28 MHz to 28.2 MHz and CW beacons from 28.2 to 28.3 MHz, it also offers phone privileges from 28.3 to 28.5 MHz. General class and above have those same privileges plus additional phone privileges from 28.5 to 29.3 MHz, access to satellite communications from 29.3 to 29.6, and FM privileges from 29.6 to 29.7 MHz. The 10-meter band plan is, with respect to the frequencies and modes already mentioned by license class, 28.0 to 28.7 allocated to CW, 28.070 to 28.150 is for RTTY and data, 28.150 to 28.190 is additional CW, 28.200 to 28.300 is set aside for beacons, 28.300 to 29.300 is phone, 28.680 is slow scan TV, and 29 to 29.2 is for AM communication.
Tell me more!
Continuing, 29.3 to 29.510 has satellite up and down links, 29.520 to 29.590 are repeater inputs, 29.60 is FM simplex, and 29.610 to 29.7 are repeater outputs. And with that, we come to the conclusion of another video. After all this was said, I have to tell you, I was not really satisfied with this video. Not for my presentation or preparation, but with the source material that I could find. The primary source for this was the ARRL, and it is my opinion that what they have presented on their website is woefully out of date. For example, presenting packet as an operating mode. 20 years ago, this was a popular mode, but even though there are still users on the air, not to the extent that the ARRL band plan would indicate. Also, I talked a lot about AM calling frequencies. I really don't use AM, so I can't really talk authoritatively, but please leave a note down in the comment section if I'm wrong. But I suspect those are now used for single sideband calling frequency. Take this as a grain of salt and as a lesson. Whenever operating in any mode, first, make sure you're operating within your license privileges. Next, listen first, then transmit, and make sure you won't be interfering with others, and make sure you're using the same mode that others are using in that same area. Make sure you and your station are set up properly. Finally, do your own research and don't depend on published information, no matter how reliable the source, even mine. 73, until the next Hey Y'all, this has been yet another ND3N Ham Shack Chat. I'm Tom, ND3N, and I am out.
Well, I thought he'd never leave.